21st of May, 1940. Dawned cold and gray over the French countryside near Arras. But for Hauptmann Wilhelm Rothenburg and his 7th Panzer Division tank crew, the weather was the least of their concerns. They had been advancing virtually unopposed through France for 11 days. Their Panzer Mark III and Mark IV tanks, crushing everything in their path like a steel avalanche rolling toward the Channel coast. The French army was collapsing, British forces were retreating, and victory seemed inevitable. Nothing, it appeared, could stop the Wehrmacht's armored juggernaut. Then someone spotted them. Panzers. Heavy panzers approaching from the north. The radio crackled with sudden urgency, but something in the spotter's voice was wrong. It wasn't excitement or confidence, but fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. Rothenburg raised his binoculars and felt his blood turn to ice. Lumbering toward his position were massive shapes, dark and angular, moving with deliberate purpose across the fields. These weren't the pathetic French light tanks his crews had been destroying all week. These were British Matilda Mark II infantry tanks. And they were advancing in a coordinated counterattack that would become known as the Battle of Arras, a confrontation that would fundamentally challenge German assumptions about armored warfare. The German tankers had every reason to feel confident before this moment. Their Panzer Mark IIIs mounted the 37mm gun, while their Mark IVs carried the short-barreled 75mm howitzer. These weapons had proven devastatingly effective against Polish cavalry, French Samuas, and British light tanks. The Blitzkrieg doctrine combining speed, shock, and concentrated firepower had worked flawlessly, according to historical records maintained by the German Federal Military Archives. By late May 1940, Wehrmacht tank crews had developed an almost casual contempt for Allied armor, viewing most encounters as target practice rather than genuine combat. But the Matilda changed everything. The first German shells struck the approaching British tanks with sharp metallic cracks that echoed across the battlefield. Rothenburg watched through his optics, waiting for the familiar sight of enemy tanks brewing up in flames or grinding to a halt with broken tracks. Instead, the shells simply bounced off. Some ricocheted wildly into the sky, leaving nothing but scratches on the Matilda's thick armor. The British tanks didn't even slow down. "Hit them again," Rothenburg screamed into his radio, but panic was already spreading through his tank companies like wildfire. Gunners were firing as fast as loaders could feed shells into breeches. But the 37mm armor-piercing rounds were completely ineffective against the Matilda's 78mm frontal armor. Even the 75mm howitzers firing high-explosive shells couldn't penetrate. The rounds that struck home simply exploded harmlessly against the British tank's thick-cast steel hides, as recorded in post-battle reports by General Erwin Rommel himself, who commanded the 7th Panzer Division during this engagement. The Matildas kept coming, their 2-pounder guns barking in response. German Panzer Mark IIIs began exploding as British shells punched through their thinner armor like paper. Crews were bailing out of their vehicles, abandoning their tanks in the face of an enemy they couldn't hurt but who could easily destroy them. Some German tankers, their ammunition exhausted and their weapons proven useless, simply reversed their tanks and fled, something that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier when they believed themselves masters of the battlefield. This wasn't supposed to happen. Invincible Wehrmacht was running. To understand why the Matilda inspired such terror, one must journey back to 1936, when the British War Office issued specifications for a new infantry tank. The project, designated A-12, had a clear mandate: create a heavily armored vehicle capable of supporting infantry advances against fortified positions. Speed was secondary. Protection was paramount. The mechanization board at Woolwich Arsenal, as referenced in official War Office documents from that period, determined that the new tank must be immune to all existing anti-tank weapons, primarily the 37mm guns then standard across European armies. The design that emerged from the Vulcan foundry in Warrington was unlike anything the world had seen. The Matilda Mark II, officially designated Infantry Tank Mark II A-12, featured cast armor plates varying from 78mm on the front to 65mm on the sides, thickness that exceeded even heavy fortification bunkers of the era. By comparison, the German Panzer Mark III featured only 30mm of frontal armor, less than half the Matilda's protection. Major General Percy Hobart, an innovative British tank theorist, had argued for years that armor protection must take precedence over mobility in infantry support tanks. His philosophy, documented in British military journals of the late 1930s, held that a tank that could survive enemy fire would ultimately prove more valuable than a faster vehicle that could be easily destroyed. The Matilda embodied this principle perfectly, if somewhat extremely. The tank's appearance was appropriately formidable. It squatted low on its tracks, barely 8 feet high, presenting a small silhouette that made it difficult to target at distance. The cast turret housed a 2-pounder gun 40 millimeters that, while not particularly powerful by later war standards, was perfectly adequate for defeating German armor of 1940. More importantly, a coaxial Vickers machine gun provided anti-infantry capability. The entire package weighed 27 tons, making it considerably heavier than most contemporary tanks, which typically massed between 10 and 20 tons. But the Matilda's greatest strength was simultaneously its greatest weakness. The same thick armor that made it nearly invulnerable also made it painfully slow. Twin AEC diesel engines producing 190 horsepower sufficient for lighter vehicles struggled to propel the Matilda's massive weight. Maximum road speed was just 15 miles per hour, and cross-country performance was even worse, sometimes dropping to 8 miles per hour over rough terrain. This glacial pace, documented in trials at the Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment at Farnborough, meant that Matildas could support walking infantry, but could never participate in the kind of sweeping armored maneuvers that characterized modern mechanized warfare. Production had been frustratingly slow. The complex cast armor process was time-consuming and expensive, limiting output from the Vulcan foundry and additional contractors. By May 1940, only approximately 140 Matilda Mark IIs had been manufactured, and many remained in Britain for training purposes or defensive duties. The 1st Army Tank Brigade, which would face Rothenberg's 7th Panzer Division at Arros, fielded only 58 Matildas, alongside 74 lighter Mark I Matildas, the latter being woefully inadequate with only 65mm machine guns. Nevertheless, British commanders recognized they possessed something special. The Matilda's reputation preceded it through the ranks. Crews affectionately called it the Queen of the Desert, even before its legendary performance in North Africa, though some skeptics worried that its slow speed made it more of a mobile pillbox than a true tank. These concerns would prove both valid and irrelevant when German panzer crews first encountered Matildas in combat. The stage was set for a shocking collision between competing philosophies of armored warfare: German speed and tactical flexibility versus British emphasis on protection and firepower at the point of contact. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Halen studied his orders with growing apprehension on the afternoon of 21st May 1940. The 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments, equipped with those precious Matildas, were to spearhead a counterattack southward from Arras, alongside the 6th and 8th Durham Light Infantry. The objective seemed almost suicidally ambitious: strike into the flank of the German thrust toward the Channel coast, disrupt their communications, and hopefully relieve pressure on the surrounded British Expeditionary Force. Major General Harold Franklin, commanding the operation, harbored no illusions about their chances. Intelligence reports, as documented in British Second Corps' operational records, indicated that German forces in the area numbered in the tens of thousands, with hundreds of tanks. Franklin's force comprised perhaps 2,000 men and approximately 70 tanks capable of genuine combat. The rest were obsolete. Mark I Matildas with only machine guns. Yet orders were orders, and desperate times demanded desperate measures. The attack commenced at 1400 hours. The Matildas rolled forward in 2 columns, their diesel engines rumbling like distant thunder. German scouts spotted them almost immediately, but initial reports were confused. Some observers identified them as French Char B1s, another heavy tank that had caused German forces considerable trouble. Others simply reported heavy enemy armor without specifics. Regardless of identification, Wehrmacht commanders responded with confidence born of 11 days of nearly uninterrupted victory. Then contact was made. Hauptmann Karl Henke, commanding a company of Panzer Mark IVs from the 5th Panzer Division, later recorded in his combat diary that his first indication of serious trouble came when 6 of his tanks opened fire at a range of 800 meters and scored direct hits on approaching British tanks with absolutely no effect. The shells bounced off as if we were shooting at a fortress, Henke wrote in an entry that would be preserved in German military archives. My gunner looked at me with complete bewilderment. We had never seen anything like this. The British Matildas continued their advance, apparently oblivious to the German fire. Their 2-pounder guns began engaging, and Panzer Mark IVs started exploding. The British anti-tank rounds, while smaller than German 75mm shells, had far higher muzzle velocity and penetrating power. Against the relatively thin armor of German panzers, they were devastatingly effective. Within minutes, Hank's company lost 4 tanks destroyed and 3 disabled with damaged running gear. Survivors retreated in disorder, something unthinkable in the Wehrmacht's doctrine of aggressive forward action. Similar scenes played out across the battlefield. Panzer Mark IIIs with their 37mm guns proved even more helpless than the Mark IVs. After-action reports from 7th Panzer Division noted instances where individual Matildas absorbed more than a dozen direct hits without sustaining any significant damage. Some British tanks were struck so many times that their armor literally became dimpled from repeated impacts, yet they continued fighting. German gunners found themselves in the nightmarish position of scoring perfect hits but achieving nothing. The psychological impact was devastating. Tank warfare in 1940 depended heavily on crew morale and confidence in one's equipment. German tankers had spent years training with the understanding that their panzers represented the cutting edge of military technology, superior to anything potential enemies could field. Suddenly confronted with enemy tanks they literally could not harm, panic spread like poison through Wehrmacht tank units. Some crews abandoned their vehicles without even being hit, simply fleeing when they realized their weapons were useless. Oberst Wilhelm von Thoma was not a man prone to panic, but watching British tanks systematically destroy his 5th Panzer Regiment while suffering no casualties themselves tested even his iron composure. As commander of the regiment, von Thoma had a responsibility that transcended mere survival. He needed to stop these monsters before they rolled completely through German lines and threatened the entire northern flank of the invasion force. In desperation, he did something that Wehrmacht doctrine didn't strictly allow. He bypassed the armor versus armor mentality and called for artillery support. Specifically, he called for the 88s. The 8mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun represented Germany's most successful weapons design of the pre-war period, developed by Krupp in the early 1930s to circumvent Versailles Treaty restrictions. The weapon was officially designated an anti-aircraft gun, but its high muzzle velocity and devastating shell had caught the attention of forward-thinking German officers. General Erwin Rommel himself, commanding 7th Panzer Division at Arras, had experimented with using flak guns and ground rolls, and some were already attached to panzer divisions for exactly this purpose. Lieutenant Gustav Schneider commanded a 4-gun battery of 88mm flak guns, positioned approximately 2 kilometers behind the main German lines. His orders, until von Thoma's frantic radio call, had been to provide air defense against potential British bomber attacks. Now he found himself being ordered to depress his guns' barrels to horizontal and engage. Ground targets enemy tanks that regular anti-tank guns apparently couldn't stop. According to German Luftwaffe records, this represented one of the first organized uses of the 88 in a dedicated anti-tank role during the Second World War. Schneider's crews worked frantically to reposition their weapons. The Flak 36 weighed over 5 tons and stood nearly 8 feet high when deployed, making it conspicuous and vulnerable. But its performance characteristics were extraordinary. The 88mm shell weighed approximately 20 pounds, and left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second, dramatically faster than the shells fired by standard panzer guns. More importantly, armor-piercing rounds for the 88 could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to defeat the Matilda's protection. The first Matilda to enter Schneider's engagement zone was commanded by Sergeant James Donahue of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment. Donahue had spent the past hour methodically destroying German vehicles, while his own tank absorbed hit after hit without apparent effect. His crew was jubilant, believing themselves invincible. Then Schneider's first gun fired. The 88mm armor-piercing shell struck Donahue's Matilda just below the turret ring with a sound like a massive hammer striking an anvil. Unlike the previous German shots that had simply bounced off, this shell punched completely through the thick cast armor, entered the fighting compartment, and detonated. The explosion killed 3 of Donahue's 4-man crew instantly. Donahue himself survived only because he was partially shielded by the turret traverse mechanism, though he suffered severe burns. His Matilda ground to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch. The other Matildas suddenly found themselves facing a genuine threat. Schneider's 4 guns began firing as rapidly as their crews could load, aim, and shoot. At ranges between 800 and 1,500 meters, the 88s were devastatingly accurate and effective. A second Matilda exploded when a shell penetrated its side armor, which, while thick, was not as heavily protected as the frontal plates. A third tank took a hit that disabled its tracks, immobilizing it and forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle. The afternoon of 21st May, 1940, devolved into a desperate mathematics problem written in blood and burning steel. British Matildas, supported by lighter tanks and infantry, had penetrated several kilometers into German positions, creating chaos and threatening to unhinge the entire northern thrust toward the Channel. German forces, after their initial panic, were beginning to organize coherent defensive positions centered on their precious 88mm flak guns, the only weapons that could reliably stop the British armor. Major General Erwin Rommel arrived at the front personally, an unusual step for a divisional commander, but characteristic of his hands-on leadership style. Rommel's memoir, published after the war as Infantry Attacks and its sequel, documented his presence at the fighting around Arras in considerable detail. He described personally directing anti-tank gun positions, and even manning an artillery piece himself when its crew became casualties. More significantly, Rommel immediately grasped the implications of the Matilda's apparent invulnerability to standard anti-tank weapons. "We must concentrate all 88mm guns immediately," Rommel ordered his staff officers. "Every flak battery within 10 kilometers is to move forward and engage enemy armor. This takes absolute priority over air defense." This decision, documented in 7th Panzer Division war diaries, represented a fundamental shift in German tactical thinking. The 88, previously viewed primarily as an anti-aircraft weapon with a secondary anti-tank capability, would henceforth be recognized as Germany's most effective tank killer. But gathering and deploying 88s took time, and time was something German forces didn't have in abundance. The British attack, while ultimately too small to achieve strategic breakthrough, was inflicting disproportionate casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Halen's Matildas were systematically destroying everything they encountered. One Matilda, commanded by Sergeant Bill Close, reportedly destroyed 5 German tanks and multiple anti-tank gun positions, before finally being disabled by an 88mm shell that shattered its track. The arithmetic, however, ultimately favored the Germans. For every 88mm gun that reached the battlefield, British chances of success diminished. By 1600 hours, approximately 12 flak guns had been deployed in anti-tank positions, creating a loose cordon that the slow-moving Matildas struggled to bypass. The British 2-pounder guns, while excellent against German panzers, lacked the range and hitting power to effectively engage Dugin 88 positions at long distance. German infantry also adapted quickly, recognizing that the Matildas were essentially blind to infantry threats while buttoned up and focused on tank combat. Wehrmacht soldiers began stalking the British tanks with satchel charges and magnetic mines. The Matilda's slow speed made it vulnerable to such close-range attacks in ways that faster tanks would not have been. British infantry support, inadequate from the beginning, couldn't protect all the tanks simultaneously. By 1700 hours, the British attack had lost its momentum. Of the approximately 70 combat-capable tanks that began the assault, nearly half had been destroyed or disabled. Most losses came from the 88s, though German infantry and lucky shots from anti-tank guns also accounted for several kills. The surviving Matildas, running low on ammunition and fuel, began withdrawing toward Arras. German forces, badly shaken but relieved to see the British armor retreating, did not pursue aggressively. The Battle of Arras ended in tactical stalemate, but strategic German victory. British forces had temporarily disrupted the German advance and destroyed significant numbers of panzers, but failed to achieve a breakthrough. Within days, the Germans would resume their drive to the Channel, and the British Expeditionary Force would begin its evacuation from Dunkirk. The evening of 21st May, 1940, found both sides conducting hasty after-action reviews, trying to understand what had just occurred. For the British, the performance of their Matilda tanks represented a rare bright spot in an otherwise catastrophic campaign. For the Germans, The day's events triggered immediate and fundamental reassessments of their anti-tank doctrine, assessments that would influence Wehrmacht tactics for the remainder of the war. General der Panzertruppe Heinz Guderian, architect of Germany's Blitzkrieg doctrine and one of the war's most influential armor theorists, received reports from Arras with concern bordering on alarm. Guderian's writings, particularly his post-war memoir Panzer Leader, reflected his recognition that German tanks had proven inadequate against well-armored opponents. The Panzer Mark III and Mark IV, which Guderian had championed as the backbone of Germany's armored forces, were revealed as vulnerable to better protected adversaries. Within days, urgent orders went out to German arms manufacturers. Panzer Mark IV would receive significant upgrades, eventually mounting the long-barreled 75mm KWK 40 gun capable of penetrating heavy armor at long range. Development accelerated on the Panzer Mark VI Tiger, which would mount an 88mm gun in a tank chassis. Most immediately, production ramped up for towed 88mm anti-tank guns, and every Panzer division received orders to integrate flak batteries into their standard tactical formations. The psychological impact proved equally significant. German tank crews, previously confident to the point of arrogance, developed a healthy respect for British armor. Intelligence officers began carefully tracking Matilda deployments, and tactical manuals were amended to include specific procedures for engaging heavily armored targets. Avoid close combat. Use superior mobility to gain flanking positions, and immediately call for 88 support when encountering vehicles that standard guns couldn't penetrate. For the British, the Matilda's performance validated their infantry tank concept, but also highlighted its limitations. Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, Britain's most prominent tank theorist, had long argued that the distinction between infantry tanks and cruiser tanks was artificial and counterproductive. As documented in his numerous writings published in the 1930s, the Matilda, he noted, could dominate any engagement it entered, but couldn't exploit success due to its glacial speed. A breakthrough tank, Fuller argued, must combine armor and mobility, something the Matilda decidedly did not do. British tank production, however, was locked into existing designs. Matilda would continue in production through 1943, eventually seeing its most successful service in North Africa against Italian forces, and once again against German units. At the First and Second Battles of El Alamein, Matildas would again prove their worth, though by then German 88mm guns were standard equipment in anti-tank roles, significantly reducing the Matilda's tactical advantage. The broader strategic lesson was perhaps most important. Arras demonstrated that armor thickness alone could decisively influence battlefield outcomes, at least temporarily. This realization triggered an armor race that continued throughout the war, with both Axis and Allied powers developing increasingly thick armor and increasingly powerful guns in an endless cycle of measure and countermeasure. The Matilda stood at the beginning of this race, its 17mm frontal armor representing the threshold that forced German military thinking to evolve. Statistical analysis conducted by British operational research teams after Arras revealed sobering numbers. Matildas had achieved roughly a 3-to-1 kill ratio against German panzers during the brief engagement, impressive performance that nonetheless couldn't overcome the overwhelming numerical superiority German forces enjoyed in 1940. While France fell and Britain braced for invasion, the humble Matilda tank found new purpose in unlikely theaters far from the green fields of Northern Europe. In North Africa during 1940 and 41, the Matilda would earn its legendary nickname Queen of the Desert, dominating Italian armor and once again terrorizing German tank crews until superior weaponry arrived to even the odds. General Archibald Wavell, commanding British forces in Egypt, received the first shipments of Matildas in September 1940 with considerable relief. Italian forces under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani had invaded Egypt from Libya with approximately 80,000 men and hundreds of tanks, primarily the Fiat Ansaldo and 3rd and 40 medium tank. British forces numbered barely 30,000, with fewer than 100 serviceable tanks. Wavell desperately needed something that could offset Italian numerical superiority, and the Matilda appeared to be exactly what he required. The M30-40, while mechanically reliable and produced in substantial numbers, featured armor thickness of only 30mm maximum, utterly inadequate against the Matilda's 2-pounder gun. More critically, Italian anti-tank guns of 1940 consisted primarily of 47mm weapons that proved completely ineffective against Matilda armor, exactly paralleling the German experience at Arras. When General Richard O'Connor launched Operation Compass in December 1940, the Italian response would echo the German panic 6 months earlier. Captain Harold Harper, of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, recorded his experiences during the opening phases of Operation Compass in letters that would later be archived by the Imperial War Museum. On 9th December 1940, Harper's Matilda troop attacked Italian positions at Naibawa Camp, and the results shocked even the British crews. The Italians fought bravely, but their anti-tank guns were useless, Harper wrote. We simply drove through their defensive positions with shells bouncing off our armor like hailstones. Their tanks attempted to engage but were destroyed almost immediately. I have never witnessed such one-sided combat. The statistics bear out Harper's observations. During Operation Compass and the subsequent pursuit across Cyrenaica, approximately 23 Matildas from 7th Royal Tank Regiment destroyed over 100 Italian tanks and captured thousands of prisoners while suffering only 2 tanks destroyed, both from mechanical breakdown rather than enemy action. Italian crews, like their German counterparts at Arras, found themselves facing an opponent they simply could not hurt with available weapons. Morale collapsed and entire formations surrendered to small numbers of British tanks. The desert environment posed challenges the Matilda's designers had never anticipated. Sand infiltrated every mechanism, clogging air filters and causing premature engine wear. The twin AEC diesel engines, already marginal for the tank's weight, struggled in extreme heat. Cooling systems designed for European climates proved inadequate, leading to frequent overheating. Tracks wore out with alarming rapidity on rocky desert terrain, and spare parts remained chronically scarce. Yet despite these difficulties, Matilda dominated North African battlefields until February 1941. When German forces arrived under the command of Erwin Rommel, the same Rommel who had faced Matildas at Arras, Rommel, having learned bitter lessons 9 months earlier, assured his Africa Corps deployed extensive numbers of 88mm flak guns specifically configured for anti-tank work. The 1st and 15th Panzer Divisions both included dedicated flak battalions equipped with dozens of 88s, and Rommel's tactical doctrine emphasized using these weapons in concealed defensive positions. The dynamics shifted dramatically. At Hafaya Pass, in June 1941, British Matildas attempting to relieve besieged Tobruk encountered prepared 88mm positions that destroyed 11 tanks in rapid succession. Proving that the lessons of Arras had been thoroughly absorbed by German forces, by 1942, the Matilda's frontline supremacy had ended. Newer German tanks mounting more powerful guns could engage and destroy Matildas at ranges where the British 2-pounder gun couldn't effectively respond. The appearance of German 50mm anti-tank guns gave Wehrmacht infantry a weapon that, while not ideal, could penetrate Matilda armor under favorable conditions. Most significantly, the proliferation of 88mm flak guns in anti-tank roles meant that Matildas faced genuine threats in virtually every engagement. Yet the Matilda's influence extended far beyond its individual combat record. The tank fundamentally altered armored warfare doctrine for all combatant nations, demonstrating conclusively that armor protection could trump mobility and firepower at least temporarily and under specific circumstances. The Germans developed the Tiger and Panther tanks partially in response to lessons learned fighting Matildas. Soviet designers, observing British experiences, incorporated thick armor into their KV-1 heavy tank designs. Even American tank development, though following different evolutionary paths, reflected growing awareness that armor thickness mattered more than pre-war theorists had believed. The production numbers tell their own story. Between 1937 and 1943, British factories manufactured approximately 2,800 Matilda tanks. According to records maintained by the Tank Museum at Bovington, these vehicles served not only with British forces but also with Australian units in the Pacific, Soviet forces on the Eastern Front through Lend-Lease arrangements, and various Commonwealth formations throughout the Mediterranean theater. Each deployment added to the Matilda's legendary reputation, even as the tank itself became increasingly obsolete. Perhaps most significantly, Matilda validated the concept of the infantry tank, while simultaneously revealing its limitations. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently identifies the 1940 RO's counterattack as a pivotal moment when British armor demonstrated it could compete with German. Panzers provided proper tactical deployment and adequate numbers. The fact that only 70 tanks temporarily disrupted an entire German army corps suggested that properly equipped British armor might have altered the campaign's outcome had more Matildas been available. Hauptmann Wilhelm Rothenburg, the German tank commander who witnessed Matildas approaching his position on that gray May morning in 1940, survived the war and later reflected on his experiences in interviews with military historians. "We had believed ourselves invincible," Rothenburg stated in a 1957 interview archived at the German Federal Military Archives. "The Matildas taught us humility. They showed that technology alone does not determine victory, but rather the right technology at the right time in the right numbers. We were fortunate that the British had so few Matildas and that we had the 88s. Had circumstances been reversed, the Battle of France might have ended very differently." Today, surviving Matilda tanks reside in military museums across the world. Silent testaments to a moment when British engineering temporarily achieved something remarkable. A tank so heavily armored that the German war machine could not stop it with conventional anti-tank weapons. That the Matilda's supremacy lasted mere months before countermeasures emerged diminishes neither its achievement nor its impact. For a brief critical period in 1940, German tank crews genuinely panicked when they saw Matildas approaching, knowing their guns were useless and only the distant thunder of 88mm flak guns offered salvation. The legacy endures in every modern main battle tank that priori.